Hi, how is everybody out there today? I thought I would talk about something a little bit different. It came to my attention recently that the World Health Organization had written something proclaiming that there was an epidemic of loneliness and isolation. And of course, this is somewhat news to me because hasn't this existed through all of mankind? Earlier this year, the Surgeon General of the U.S. and the Health and Human Services Department put out this our epidemic of loneliness and isolation. I don't know if this is some kind of response to a post-COVID survey taking exercise or what it is, but if you know anything about art, literature, drama, human existence in general, it seems to me like this has all been existing since the very beginning of recorded history. It's 82 pages long. I read the entire thing. I didn't learn anything that didn't already exist from throughout human history. And just on a personal note, and a word of advice to anybody who wants to take it, if you are feeling incredibly lonely, don't make any life decisions and don't think that something is going to remove that loneliness outside of you. Don't try and fill the gap with anything and think that it's going to remove that, because you will end up in a far worse situation. Interestingly, being incredibly lonely is like being in love, in that you're not in your right mind. Functions of the frontal cortex, which contain logic, are somehow disconnected, and you're operating on some sort of, dare I say it, reptilian level. So I know I've made extremely poor decisions through being utterly lonely and feeling desperate. So I don't recommend decision making if you feel that way. And also, another word of advice, try to remember in the back of your head that this is momentary, as long as it goes on for, and it's seemingly going to feel like it will in fact go on forever. This is just a temporary state of mind. So it will eventually leave, and you will feel better, even though it feels like there's no relief in sight. So those are the two very minor pieces of advice I might give people in connection with specific loneliness. As far as existential loneliness, obviously we're dealing with the human condition, and there's not really any answer to that other than to just kind of realize that there might possibly be some beauty in being the only thing out here, and possibly it might make people more appreciative of humanity as a whole, regardless of its appalling nature at points. There still is beauty to be made by humanity, obviously. And the past is filled with terror and horror and great beauty also, and I have a feeling that it's going to continue in this kind of yin-yang way, which is just human nature. Just speaking briefly about existential dread and possible sources of that within ourselves as grown humans. There was a really interesting study done in the 50s and the 60s by a psychologist called Harlow. And Harlow did these experiments with rhesus macaques. And his experiments were based on dependency, maternal affection, and the causation of the deprivation of those things. And some of you out there might have seen these famous and extremely disturbing photos of baby rhesus macaques clutching a artificial mother made out of either wire or cloth. And just as a side note, there's an incredible book about this whole series of experiments and this doctor, Dr. Harry Harlow. And the name of the book is called Love at Goon Park. And I believe it's written by Deborah Bloom. And I highly recommend this book as a read, and just an interesting history of the psychology of maternal affection and deprivation. And I feel like this is an extremely important and underrated issue of discussion just in the world at large, and where mental health issues come from for adults. I believe that there's a lot of causation of this by possibly mothers who didn't necessarily want to be mothers. They became mothers anyway, and they just couldn't help themselves in their disregard for the affections of their offspring. Now, this is highly contentious. I'm not saying that any particular mothers did this, but nevertheless, we do have epidemic also of mental illness. And I think loneliness and alienation and isolation definitely is one of the stems of mental illness, absolutely. It creates depression. I know that it did for me personally in my life. Luckily, I found a way out through difficult work with therapists, etc. So all of this stuff is intertwined, and it's very interesting that these two reports should come out in the same year. I do believe that probably we're seeing some lingering effects from COVID, but this is some really old stuff. Obviously, that Shakespeare and all of the great artists, clinicians, and psychologists that have come before us have documented and researched and brought really important information to humanity. I mean, in a way, this is a great gift to humanity. The research is out there. You just have to read it. And really, it is a normal human condition. And really, isolation, despair, sadness, loneliness are just normal parts of the human condition. This is part of it, as is happiness, joy, celebrations, all the bright side of humanity. So unless something becomes actually disturbing in life and distorts your life to the point where you cannot function normally, this is just part of it. It's like the rind on the orange, if you will. So within degrees of tolerance, all of this is completely normal. And that includes everything in life, which is kind of strange to think about. But I believe absolutely that it is. These are my beliefs, and I'm not suggesting anybody else follow any of this that I'm talking about. But I'd like to end with something equally existential that actually comes from the year 1929, I think. And this is very curious and interesting. This is interesting and excellent, and considered largely to be one of the most amazing poems written ever. And it's by T.S. Eliot. And if he sounds a little familiar to you, it's because he wrote the famous Old Possum's Book of Curious Cats, which became the blockbuster Cats, the musical by Andrew Lloyd Webber. But he did that 14 years after he wrote this incredible poem, The Hollow Men. So maybe he was trying to lighten things up a little bit after The Hollow Men, which is honestly just a brutal examination of humanity. I'm going to read from the fourth section of this, and so you'll get a little taste of it. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I suggest that you do if you're feeling like you're in the middle of anything existential, if you're feeling like you're having a specific loneliness or isolative issue. This may bring you back to earth and think, actually, it's not that bad. Anyway, here's the fourth version, the fourth part of The Hollow Men by T.S. Eliot. The eyes are not here. There are no eyes here. In this valley of dying stars, in this hollow valley, this broken jaw of our lost kingdoms, in this last of meeting places, we grope together and avoid speech, gathered on this beach of the turbid river. Sightless, useless, the eyes reappear as the perpetual star, multifoliate rose of death's twilight kingdom, the hope only of empty men. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with that. And if you're feeling existential, that will resonate. If you're feeling specifically lonely, isolated, hopefully that will cheer you up. I can't predict either way. Many, many songs, works of art are being created around both existential and personal loneliness. So I'd like to discuss a few of those. In literature, for example, we have Hemingway, Bukowski, Thomas Ligotti, the famous author of Conspiracy Against the Human Race, which, if you want a really huge dose of absolutely insane existentialism, I recommend you go there. Then we have theater, which of course contains Samuel Beckett, Chekhov, and Shakespeare, amongst others, detailing existential and personal isolation and loneliness. If we move into the sphere of art, in the late 19th century, we have the great German romantic painter Caspar David Friedrich doing his incredible canvases of usually a figure standing amongst an immense landscape with nothing else, being shrunk to almost insignificance within the landscape. We've got Edvard Munch, of course, in the earliest 20th century with his now iconic and possibly cliched painting, The Scream, of a lonely figure on a bridge, obviously being consumed by existential dread. And then Edward Hopper, the great American painter who created masterpieces like Nighthawks at the Diner. His works of art usually include somebody standing alone somewhere smoking a cigarette. Or Nighthawks at the Diner has a few people within an individual space not acknowledging each other whatsoever. Does this sound like today? It is today. And then, of course, there's Francis Bacon, whose canvases of absolute dread and isolation and existential angst are a testament to that very condition. In dance, crossing the international frontier, we have the incredible dance form of Butoh, which to me is a great cry of existentialism exhibited in the world of dance. And you can't help but watch it and feel the insignificance of mankind within the universe. And I think existentialism is really comes from people looking up at the stars for millennia and just realizing that there's nothing out there, to quote one of my songs from my album, The Bluebird. And today there's been no proof that there is something out there. Even the distance of a parsec, which is relatively close to the Earth, which translates to 20 trillion miles, there's nothing out there for 20 trillion miles, and that's in the neighborhood. So think about that, or don't think about it at all and go about your business. And then, of course, coming to music, we have just excellent examples of isolationism, existentialism, and loneliness. We could begin with the great French cellist Saint-Colombe, and his music is just filled with utter isolation and despair and loneliness. Incidentally, there's a great film about him, somewhat fictionalized, called Tout le matin du monde, and this might possibly be one of the greatest films ever made about music. and the act of creation. So I highly recommend you watch that. It has Gerard Depardieu amongst others in it, and is really a fascinating portrayal of the act of creation in utter isolation and loneliness. I recommend that. Moving along in music, we have Bach. You just have to listen to his solo music for cello, violin, and keyboard to find moments of utter loneliness, isolation, despair. And of course, Bach does have celebratory elements in his music and actual joy, and he runs the full gamut, but there are absolutely moments of isolation and loneliness within his music. Mahler, of course, has moments of incredible sadness, isolation, and loneliness within his music also. I recommend just the canon of Gustav Mahler for listening. Some of the greatest music ever created. Moving on to more popular things that may be more well known to you, we have, of course, the famous record right over there, Songs for Only the Lonely by Frank Sinatra. The title track, which I have the lyrics to right here. I'll just read the first verse. Each place I go, only the lonely go. Some little small cafe. The songs I know, only the lonely know. Each melody recalls a love that used to be. So here we have an example of specific loneliness, of which popular music has an incredible variety of, ranging from the very early days of recorded popular music in the 1890s, early 1900s to today. I would say the golden age of this style of writing was probably the 20th century. And then we also, of course, 2 years later from the Frank Sinatra track, Only the Lonely, we have a song with exactly the same name in 1960 by Roy Orbison called Only the Lonely. Yet another example of specific loneliness related to breaking up with somebody or missing a significant other person. Just on a side note, the Roy Orbison song was offered to Elvis originally. Elvis turned it down for some reason. And then when he heard the Roy Orbison version, he bought boxes of the single and handed them out to all of his friends because he loved the song so much. Moving along, we also have, of course, Elvis's incredible single, Are You Lonesome Tonight? Yet another example of specific loneliness. Of course, preceding both of those guys, we have Hank Williams, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry. And then in addition to that, Nobody's Lonesome for Me. A lot of his songs are just drenched with loneliness for a mysterious other that we only get to know through his eyes and his feeling of absence for that person. This is actually a quote from Macbeth in 1606, which I think was around the time of the first performance. So we're looking at 400 years ago, so this is not exactly news. Anyway, the quote is, and it's one of the very famous quotes from Macbeth, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player, that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and is then heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing,